Yugoslavia's breakup. The war started when Yugoslavia fell apart. This was 1991 and the Soviet Union was collapsing. In the Balkans, another communist federation was breaking apart. Yugoslavia had been 6 republics held together by communism and President Josip Broz Tito, who died in 1980. For 11 years after his death, the federation remained in place but became increasingly unstable. By 1991, the economic situation had deteriorated badly, inflation was out of control, the unifying factors that had held the country together were gone. Slovenia declared independence first and fought a brief 10-day war. Croatia followed with a much longer and bloodier conflict. Macedonia managed to leave peacefully, but Serbia, the largest and most powerful republic, saw these departures as a betrayal. Serbia controlled the Yugoslav army, dominated the federal government in Belgrade, and refused to accept the dissolution of the federation. Bosnia and Herzegovina sat in the middle of this situation with 3 main ethnic groups sharing the same territory. 44% were Bosnian Muslims called Bosniaks. 33% were Orthodox Christian Serbs who shared ethnic and religious ties with Serbia. 17% were Catholic Croats who looked to Croatia as their cultural homeland. These groups had lived side by side for decades under communism, sharing neighborhoods, working together, and intermarrying at high rates. As Yugoslavia disintegrated, nationalism replaced the old communist ideology. Politicians began emphasizing ethnic and religious differences instead of a shared Yugoslav identity. Each group feared ending up as a minority in a new nation controlled by the others. The wars in Croatia had already demonstrated what ethnic conflict in the region could look like. Serbia's leader was Slobodan Milosevic, a politician who built his career mobilizing ethnic nationalism. He aimed to create a greater Serbia by uniting all Serbian populations across the former Yugoslavia. He controlled what remained of the Yugoslav army, which was dominated by ethnic Serbs. This gave him a professional military force that he could direct toward his territorial and political goals, the independence referendum. In late 1991 and early 1992, Bosnia held a vote on independence from Yugoslavia. 63% of the population turned out. 99% of those voters said yes to independence. The Bosniaks voted overwhelmingly for independence. The Croats mostly voted yes. The Bosnian Serbs boycotted the referendum entirely. They did not want to become a minority in an independent Bosnia. They wanted to remain part of a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. Immediately after the referendum passed, Bosnian Serbs declared their own state within Bosnia's borders. They called it Republika Srpska. No country recognized this self-declared republic except Serbia. Milosevic saw this as an opportunity to expand Serbian-controlled territory and sent the Yugoslav army to help secure it. The war begins in April 1992. The United States and European countries recognized Bosnia as an independent state in April 1992. Within days, Bosnian Serb forces launched a large-scale offensive. They had the Yugoslav army behind them, professional soldiers with tanks, artillery, and heavy weapons. The Bosnian government hurried to assemble a defense force, but it was outmatched and outgunned from the start. Serbian forces moved to capture as much territory as possible. Their strategy was systematic and violent. They surrounded key cities, cut off supply lines, shelled civilian populations, and forced non-Serbs to flee. By mid-1992, Bosnian Serb forces controlled roughly 70% of Bosnia's territory. The Siege of Sarajevo. Sarajevo was Bosnia's capital, a city where Muslims, Serbs, Croats, and Jews had lived together for generations. The city had hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics. It had universities, theatres, and cafes where people of all backgrounds mixed. Bosnian Serb forces surrounded the city completely in April 1992. They positioned tanks and artillery on the hills overlooking Sarajevo. They stationed snipers at key intersections and in tall buildings. They blocked every road and supply route leading into the city. Then they opened fire. The siege lasted nearly 4 years, from April 1992 to February 1996. It became the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. Serbian forces shelled markets, hospitals, schools, and residential neighborhoods without distinction. They fired mortars during busy hours when streets were crowded. They targeted bread lines where people waited for food. Snipers targeted civilians crossing streets to get water or buy supplies. One intersection became known as Sniper Alley because so many people were shot there. More than 11,000 people died in Sarajevo during the siege. The city had no electricity for most of those 4 years. There was no running water. There was no natural gas for heating. Residents burned furniture and books for warmth during winter. They collected rainwater and melted snow for drinking. Food reached the city through a tunnel dug under the airport runway, but supplies were always insufficient. People grew vegetables in city parks and backyards. They lived in basements to reduce exposure to shelling. Children attended school in underground shelters. The psychological impact was severe. For years, residents lived with the constant risk that going outside for basic necessities could be fatal. Serbian forces destroyed the National Library, burning hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts. They targeted cultural sites deliberately, attempting to erase the city's multicultural heritage. Ethnic cleansing. While Sarajevo was under siege, Serbian forces carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing across Bosnia. The term sounds clinical, but it describes mass violence and forced removal. Serbian soldiers and paramilitary groups identified Bosniak and Croat villages. They surrounded them, separated the men from women and children, and systematically executed many of the men. Women were sent to detention camps where they were subjected to severe abuse that violated fundamental human rights. Children and elderly people were forced onto buses and expelled from the territory. Serbian forces destroyed mosques and cultural sites. They burned homes and removed evidence that non-Serbs had lived there. The objective was to create ethnically homogeneous Serbian territory. Concentration camps operated throughout Bosnian Serb-controlled areas. Thousands of Bosniak and Croat men were held in camps like Omarska, where they were starved, beaten, and killed. The war within the war. In 1993, the alliance between Bosniaks and Croats collapsed. Bosnian Croat forces, backed by Croatia's nationalist president Franjo Tuđman, decided they wanted their own ethnically defined territory as well. Bosniak forces then faced combat on two fronts. Serbian forces attacked from one side, Croatian forces attacked from the other. The Croatian offensive focused on central Bosnia. Croat forces surrounded and attacked the city of Mostar, a city they had previously defended alongside Bosniaks against Serbian forces. Croatian forces destroyed Bosniak mosques and killed Bosniak civilians. The famous bridge in Mostar, a symbol of the city's multicultural heritage, was destroyed by Croatian artillery. This internal conflict severely affected the Bosniak population. They were engaged in combat against two opponents, both carrying out ethnic cleansing campaigns. The Croatian offensive lasted until early 1994 when American diplomats brokered a ceasefire. The Bosniaks and Croats agreed to form a federation and restore their military cooperation against Serbian forces. International response and failure. The United Nations observed the conflict with increasing concern but struggled to respond effectively. The UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo on all of Yugoslavia in 1991, which meant Bosnia could not legally buy weapons to defend itself. Meanwhile, Bosnian Serbs had inherited large stockpiles from the Yugoslav army. In practice, the embargo restricted the defenders more than the forces that had already secured heavy weapons. The UN sent peacekeeping forces to Bosnia, but their mandate was limited. They could deliver humanitarian aid and monitor ceasefires. They were not authorized or equipped to use force to stop ethnic cleansing or to protect civilians from attack. UN peacekeepers often remained passive as Serbian forces committed atrocities in their vicinity. In 1992 and 1993, the UN declared several cities as safe areas. These were intended as zones where civilians could seek refuge under UN protection. Srebrenica, Zepa, Gorazde, Tuzla, Sarajevo, and Bihać were all designated as safe areas. The UN Security Council passed resolutions stating these areas would be defended. However, the UN did not commit enough troops or provide those troops with the authority and resources necessary to defend the zones. NATO enforced a no-fly zone over Bosnia starting in 1993. NATO aircraft shot down Serbian planes that violated the zone. However, air power restrictions did little to stop the ongoing violence on the ground. Serbian forces continued their campaign using tanks, artillery, and rifles. Srebrenica. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces launched a major offensive against Srebrenica, a UN-designated safe area in eastern Bosnia where nearly 40,000 Bosniaks had taken refuge. The UN had officially declared Srebrenica protected. Dutch peacekeepers were stationed there, but they numbered only about 370 soldiers, were lightly armed, and did not have authorization to use force to defend the population beyond narrow self-defense. On July 6th, Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic advanced towards Srebrenica. The Dutch peacekeepers requested NATO air support. A small number of airstrikes were carried out, but they came late and had limited effect. By July 11th, Serbian forces had entered Srebrenica without significant resistance. The Dutch peacekeepers, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered. Some were taken hostage. Around 20,000 people, mostly women, children and elderly, fled to the UN compound in Potokari just north of Srebrenica, seeking protection. Another 15,000 men, mostly of military age but including boys as young as 12 and men as old as 70, attempted to escape through the forests toward Bosnian government-controlled territory near Tuzla, roughly 30 miles away. Serbian forces anticipated this movement and set ambushes along the routes. At the UN compound, Serbian forces separated military-age men and boys from women and children. Mladic appeared on camera stating that people would be safe and that the men would only be questioned about war crimes and then released. This was false. The women, children and elderly were forced onto buses and transported to Bosnian government territory. The men were detained. Over the next 72 hours, Bosnian Serb forces executed more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. The executions were systematic and organized. Groups of prisoners were loaded onto buses, taken to warehouses, schools or fields, and shot. In some locations, prisoners were lined up and machine-gunned. In others, they were killed individually with rifles. At one execution site near Orahovac, approximately 1,000 men were murdered in a single day. At the Kravica warehouse, prisoners were confined inside, grenades were thrown in, and soldiers then fired into the building. The bodies were buried in mass graves using heavy machinery. Serbian forces later returned with bulldozers and excavators to dig up the bodies and move them to secondary burial sites, sometimes 50 kilometers away from the original locations. This was an attempt to conceal evidence of genocide, but it ultimately failed. Forensic investigators later located and exhumed the graves. DNA identification efforts have since identified over 7,000 victims, making Srebrenica one of the most thoroughly documented cases of genocide. The Srebrenica massacre was the largest mass murder in Europe since World War II. It occurred in a UN-declared safe area while UN peacekeepers were present but unable to prevent it. The international community had formally promised protection but did not provide effective defense. The massacre led Western states to initiate a more forceful military response, NATO intervention. In late August 1995, after the fall of Srebrenica and after another Serbian mortar attack on a Sarajevo marketplace killed dozens, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force. This was a sustained air campaign targeting Bosnian Serb military positions, ammunition depots, and command centers. The bombing lasted 2 weeks and was significantly more intensive than earlier NATO actions. At the same time, Bosniak and Croat forces launched a major ground offensive. They had renewed their alliance in 1994, and by 1995 they had improved coordination and capabilities. Croatian forces had recently retaken Croatian territory from Serbian control in Operation Storm. That operation and the broader military effort shifted the balance on the ground. Bosniak and Croat forces began recapturing territory from Bosnian Serb forces that were increasingly overstretched. The combination of NATO bombing and the ground offensive pushed Serbian forces back. They had controlled about 70% of Bosnia at their peak, but they began losing territory quickly. Milosevic, facing international sanctions and economic problems in Serbia, reduced support to the Bosnian Serbs in an effort to get sanctions lifted. Bosnian Serb forces then found themselves more isolated, with fewer resources and less external backing. The Dayton Accords. In November 1995, American diplomats brought the main parties to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. The location was chosen for its isolation, which limited media access and public rallies and made it harder for participants to negotiate primarily for domestic audiences. The negotiations were led by Richard Holbrooke, an American diplomat who recognized that none of the parties would obtain all of their objectives. Slobodan Milosevic represented the Bosnian Serbs, although he was officially president of Serbia and Montenegro. The Bosnian Serb leadership had given him authority to negotiate on their behalf. Alija Izetbegovic represented the Bosnian government. Franjo Tudjman represented Croatia and Bosnian Croats. Representatives from the United States, European Union and Russia also participated. The talks lasted 3 weeks and were often tense. The central issue was how to divide territory in a way that reflected the military situation while being minimally acceptable to all sides. The resulting agreement was initialed in Dayton on November 21st and formally signed in Paris on December 14, 1995. The agreement preserved Bosnia as a single state, but divided it into 2 entities with broad autonomy. 51% of the territory formed the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, controlled primarily by Bosniaks and Croats. 49% formed Republika Srpska, controlled by Bosnian Serbs. This division broadly reflected the front lines after the 1995 offensives. The Dayton Accords established a complex power-sharing government. Bosnia would have a 3-person rotating presidency, 1 representative from each ethnic group. The chair would rotate every 8 months. The central government in Sarajevo would handle foreign policy, trade, and monetary policy. The 2 entities would control most other functions, including their own police forces, education systems, and local governance. This produced a political system with 3 presidents, 13 prime ministers, 14 parliaments, and over 700 parliamentarians for a country of fewer than 4 million people. The agreement also established the Office of the High Representative, an international position with broad authority to impose laws and remove officials. To enforce the peace, 60,000 NATO troops deployed to Bosnia. The aftermath and toll. The war killed approximately 100,000 people. More than 2 million people, nearly half of Bosnia's pre-war population, were forced from their homes. The majority of the dead were Bosniaks. The majority of those displaced were Bosniaks and Croats who had been expelled from areas under Serbian control. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established to prosecute war crimes. 161 people were tried. Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb political leader, was convicted of genocide and sentenced to life in prison. Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian Serb military commander, was also convicted of genocide and sentenced to life. Slobodan Milosevic was indicted but died in prison in 2006 before his trial ended. The war created ethnic divisions that continue to shape Bosnia. Before the war, mixed marriages were common and people often lived in integrated communities. After the war, Bosnia became much more segregated. Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats now largely live in separate areas. Children often attend separate schools. The country remains deeply divided along ethnic lines, and nationalist politicians frequently rely on those divisions for political support. Republika Srpska maintains significant autonomy and its own government structures. Bosnian Serb leaders periodically threaten secession. The international community still maintains a presence in Bosnia through the Office of the High Representative, which retains the authority to impose laws and remove officials. Nearly 30 years after Dayton, Bosnia continues to operate under a peace agreement that ended active warfare but preserved many of the conflict's political and territorial outcomes. To see how the US Army's own hierarchy is structured from top to bottom, check out our breakdown. Every rank in the US Army explained in detail.